Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in one of two ways. You can simply go and write a brief review on iTunes, or you can make a donation. Today, the topic of our episode is on health and longevity. And my guest is the founder of arguably one of the most popular natural health websites on the internet, at least in North America, to my understanding, for the past 15 years, actually, Dr. Joseph Mercola. Dr. Joseph Mercola has been an activist for a long time, not only for bringing nutrition into treating health and achieving optimal outcomes, but also in things like fighting GMO foods or amalgam, that's to say, mercury-free dentistry. So, Dr. Joseph Mercola, welcome to Singularity FM.
Well, thank you for having me, Socrates. Or Nicola.
Fantastic, excellent. So, if I were to ask you to introduce yourself in your own sentence or two, what's the best way to do that?
Well, I'm a physician. First and foremost, I've seen tens of thousands of patients, and then I realized after a while I wouldn't be able to impact as many people as if I didn't leverage one of my other talents, which is passions, which is technology, and we've been the most visited natural health site in the world, not just in North America, for the last 15 years. So we've had an impact. We reach about 15 million unique visitors every month. So we're able to really help people understand the truth about health and avoid some of the challenges that conventional medicine provides.
Yeah, as part of my research on you for the last couple of days, I've been looking and seeing that you have almost 300,000 subscribers on your YouTube channel and a couple of million people on Facebook, and maybe 300,000 or 150 or 200,000 on Instagram. I forget, but you're getting out there. So some people have also called you an activist due to your involvement in campaigns against GMO foods or mercury-free, amalgam-free dentistry. Would you agree with that qualification?
Well, absolutely. About 6 or 7 years ago, I realized that we needed to do more than just provide people with information, because there were barriers to them implementing the information. So we donate about 20% of our net profits to these nonprofit companies that helps make a difference. Excellent. And we just like in mercury, we've been able to actually catalyze the acceleration of the removal of mercury from dentistry considerably. So there's been World Health Organization treaties that have been signed now to eliminate mercury from dentistry, pretty much in most all major countries in the world.
Yeah, I've been in North America now for over 20 years, maybe 21 years. And it's amazing to me that it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not an expert and I haven't followed the field, but those are just my impressions, that kind of movement in Europe started sort of like maybe in the mid-90s even, and has actually gained, is a lot more popular and prevalent and predominant, so much so that I honestly don't know anyone in Europe who is doing mercury or amalgam fillings now. Is that correct?
I believe so. So it's just, there's some major challenges in the United States, primarily related to the ADA, the American Dental Association. And
yeah, but why? That's what I wanted to ask you. Why do we have that resistance to change here? I mean, the United States is supposed to be very technologically inclined, forward-looking society, and then why do we have this resistance to change to something that we know has? I mean, mercury is a neurotoxin, isn't it?
Yes, a very potent neurotoxin, one that should be avoided, and even the EPA acknowledges. So the answer to your question is really multiple. One is the human nature, which is essentially part of is really reluctant to admit they've made a mistake. And then there's a liability concern. If the ADA admits that they were putting a neurotoxin, which they claim to this day they still don't claim that, then there's potential liability there. So, and then just human nature not wanting to admit they're wrong, no matter what it is. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with health. It could be with politics or whatever their position is.
I
So, and then finally, and not so much in this case because there's not really some big interest, but usually it's large industrial corporations that have very effective lobbying efforts and essentially control the federal regulatory agencies. But I don't think, I mean, they definitely control the FDA to a certain extent that we've documented that, but it's not as much as we see in other areas, especially like telecommunications and EMF exposures.
Right. So I would presume some kind of such lobbying effort, but I just can't find an interest that, or a group of companies or producers who would have an interest in keeping.
Yeah, it's the amalgam producers, and we documented that they've funded and supported former FDA commissioners, so then they recuse themselves from making important decisions, and essentially they just kick the can down the road. So
that's so sad. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit and sort of zoom out before we go into all the nitty-gritty and the details about some important things that we need to discuss.
Sure.
But first, tell me, what is this thing called osteopathic medicine, and how is it different from general medicine?
Well, I'm a physician. I have the same license to practice medicine, prescribe drugs, and do surgery as an MD would be in any state. So there's no difference in that. But the reason I chose to go to osteopathic school as opposed to medical school is that philosophically they were more inclined towards my interest in medicine, which is more looking at the foundational causes of disease. Now, practically when I went in, turns out there's not much of a difference. And initially that's the way they started, but they've kind of got corrupted along the way. So sadly, that's the case. But the other component, of course, is maybe not, of course, but there's a real strong emphasis on the importance of structural integrity of the body and structure and function, so that if your spine is out of alignment, that can contribute to not only pain but also visceral or organ dysfunction too.
Mm-hmm. So is it fair to say it's a lot more holistic of an approach?
I think that would be a good summary, yes.
Mm-hmm. And what would be, for example, if you could even go that way, to say what are the sort of the benefits and the costs of osteopathy versus general medicine and vice versa, if there's any such thing?
Well, I don't think there's a lot of difference. Ultimately, it boils down to the individual physician and what their passions are and what their specific training is. So you can have either certification and training, and one can be excellent because they've really studied and done significant postgraduate training and learning these principles and applying them. So it really matters what happens after school, not so much what's in school.
Mm-hmm. And where does this passion to get involved into medicine and nutrition and sort of improving people's health originate from? Do you come from a family of physicians? Do you come from a very poorly health background? Or what was the spark, if you will?
Well, it's not from a personal health tragedy, that's for sure. I was really an interest and a passion in optimizing things. And I was an outlier in medical school. I was looked at quite oddly because I wanted to get people healthy when pretty much everyone there wanted to treat disease. So not that the model's right or wrong, but they had a different perspective than I did. So, and I went into medical school to learn how to do that. So it's just what your motivations are. And, what preceded my interest in health was my interest in technology. So I've been able to combine those two passions and effectively help people understand some of the basic truths about how to keep themselves healthy without suffering the consequences of exposure to conventional medicine.
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking here at your website. Can you share with us what's your mission?
Well, it can be summarized in our motto, which is to help people take control of their health. And of course, there's a lot of subtitles to that. And essentially, it's empowering people with the tools and the resources that they need, primarily education, but then we have some other resources that people can avail themselves to implement so that they can change their life. They don't have to die prematurely and suffer needlessly. I mean, if you think about it, there's so many people dropping dead from cancer and heart disease, and almost the vast majority of that is completely unnecessary.
Yeah, and speaking of education, let me just make one general sort of remark here, and then we can sort of clear that out of the way and jump in there. And so, and this goes like this: um, we are all here in my community, my audience, and me hold education, and especially self-education, at the highest level
Mm-hmm.
of respect. And that's why my job here is not to tell people what to do or what to eat, but simply to share a diversity of perspectives with them,
Mm-hmm.
often mutually exclusive. And then each one of us should get the education and the capacity as a rational human being to make a choice as to what's the best way to proceed forward, which is
Mm-hmm.
why I bring a diversity of people. And so it's been a few years now, but I brought originally Dave Osprey from
Sure.
Bulletproof
Friend.
Executive.
Yeah.
Then most recently, as you know, about a month or so ago, I brought Dr. Michael Greger.
Mm-hmm.
And today I'm bringing you. And each of every of one of those occasions, I've been severely criticized for bringing those people, bringing their points of view. But my
Mm-hmm.
point here is not to tell people again what to do, but to share a number of perspectives. Now, I have strong opinions too, but I don't think they're necessarily any better than most other people. So you guys choose for yourself, and which is why we have here Dr. Mercola. And by the way, you will discover perhaps in our course of conversations that while we have some disagreements on certain issues, um, the vast majority of things we agree strongly upon,
Mm-hmm.
and that's very good, I think. But
Sure.
yet we learn from people with whom we disagree.
Sure.
And hence
Absolutely. No one understands the whole picture.
exactly. All right. So now this out of the way, let's talk about health. What are
Mm-hmm.
the biggest impediments to people being healthy today in North America or in the world in general?
Two big issues I can think of. One is the food we eat, and the other is the toxins that we're exposed to. So, with respect to the food, there are some pretty powerful lobbying agents in the food industry that have been able to manipulate federal regulatory agencies to push people in the directions that benefit their long term profits and not people's long term health. An example of that would be the last 5 decades of this low fat diet myth that has resulted in an epidemic of obesity, where we now have 40% in many states and close to that in others of the people are obese, and almost 70% of people overweight. I mean, that's insane when you think about it. And then we have an epidemic of heart disease and cancer and diabetes. And one of the foundational cores of all those is something we call insulin resistance. The insulin receptor sensitivity is diminished as largely as a result of excessive consumption of processed carbohydrates and bad fats. So when you and if you do sophisticated, even conventional medicine like the CDC will acknowledge that 50%, 1 out of 2 people are insulin resistant. But if you use more sophisticated test like essentially the oral insulin tolerance test, where you give a glucose challenge and then measure insulin levels for 4 hours, you'll find 85% of the population is insulin resistant. 85%. So that's, to me, one of the most important physical issues that needs to be addressed to resolve that insulin resistance. And it's relatively easy to do. I've written a number of books about how to do that: Effortless Healing, Fat for Fuel. And I'm sure there's more ways than the ones I've written about it, but resolve that. I don't care how you do it; it's got to be resolved. And then the toxic exposures, certainly, we've had an epidemic of release of industrial toxins, primarily fat-soluble toxins, and some of them have been banned, but they still persist. Things like DDT and PCBs and mercury into the environment, and lead. I mean, look at the crazy, ridiculous things that happen to lead just because of the influence of the oil industry, essentially. And they allow, and then they wanted to obviously sell their products. So then they had the cars going, and there was knocking. So they had to get rid of the knock, and they put in lead into the gas. And even though it was known for centuries that it was toxic, they just fabricated things. They dressed it up. They called it ethyl. They gave it a woman's name. And essentially made it seem innocuous, and it's contributed so much pathology over the decades. And it was actually through the actions of a courageous activist, Claire Patterson, who was a man who died a while ago, but he took a lot of arrows in it. He did some really groundbreaking research to prove that by exploring the lead concentrations in the Arctic ice shelf, that it was a toxin that didn't exist there before they started polluting the environment. So, similarly, there's the same story with going on with so many of these things. But one of the most pervasive, and I believe most pernicious, largely not only because of the pathology that it contributes to, but also because of the massive and suppression of the truth through the telecommunications industry, which literally dwarfs the influence of the pharmaceutical and food industries combined. And people aren't aware of that. They're a very, very powerful industry. Just to give you one example of that, the chief lobbyist for the telecommunications is Tom Wheeler, and he was appointed the FCC chairman. And if that is an example of the fox guarding the henhouse, I don't know what it is. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that they are telling us and manipulating the data and skewing things, even when studies are produced, to say that EMF exposures are safe, and they're not. And even though the World Health Organization,
electromagnetic radiation.
Yes, even though in 2011, the World Health Organization classified cell phones as a class 2B carcinogen, which means it's probable carcinogen, or possible carcinogen, possible. But it's sort of a moot issue because it really is a 1A. There's no difference between that and smoking. I mean, they're equally equivalent to carcinogens. And it won't be widely known for a number of decades probably, because it takes that long before you see the epidemic of disease. And smoking case, of course, is lung cancer mostly, and heart disease. So we're and it's silent. You don't even know. We have big celebrities dying from brain tumors caused by cell phones, and no one even acknowledges it. Like John McCain, the U.S. senator, just passed away recently. It was absolutely related to the cell phone exposure, but no one mentions it. So that's just, brain tumors are once. It also contributes to infertility, which is in epidemic proportions, Alzheimer's disease, premature aging, and heart arrhythmias. If anyone watching this has an atrial arrhythmia, it's one of the things to look at is to radically reduce your EMF exposure, because these EMFs, I've known they were a problem for decades, but I didn't understand the mechanism. And thankfully, Dr. Martin Pall, Pall, wrote an article, a study in 2013 that I think he could be a candidate for a Nobel Prize for this. But he identified the mechanism, which is related to voltage-gated calcium channels. So, and in most of your cells, you have these calcium channels embedded in them, and they essentially regulate the entry of calcium from outside the cell, which is really high, to inside the cell, which is relatively low. And calcium is an important signaling molecule. And when it enters prematurely and in high concentrations and doses, it causes the release of nitric oxide and superoxide, which combine to form one of the most pernicious free radicals. It's not technically a free radical, but it functions like a free radical, which is called peroxynitrite. Have you heard of that? No. Socrates? Okay, yeah. I'm not surprised that you haven't. But if anyone is interested in this topic, there's a really great study, peroxynitrite, or nitric oxide in health and disease, and it's written by Paul Patcher, Pacher. And all I have to do is type that in Google, and you'll get a link to the PubMed study, which is 140 pages and has 1,400 references. And the reason I mentioned that is it's a landmark paper. And it was written like 10 years ago. But it is literally, I read probably 1,000 studies a year or more. And it's one of the best studies I've ever read, because you don't have to have medical training to understand this, but it really addresses the foundational issue that I think contributes to one of our, both our passions that we both share, which is longevity, which foundationally focuses on, what is the core of oxidative stress? And I'm sure you're familiar with Dennis Harmon's theory, free radical theory of aging, right?
Yes, I've heard.
In the 50s, but that really, it was started us on the right direction. We know there's oxidative stress, but it really, if it was true, then just taking antioxidants would solve things, but it doesn't. It makes things worse. Yeah. It's because it's it's an indiscriminate suppressor of free radicals.
So let me ask you this then. So what do we do in this case? To me personally, from a pure physics point of view, we know that, let's say, for example, our brains contain certain kind of molecules. And we know that from purely physics point of view, molecules interact with electromagnetic radiation. Like
Absolutely,
there's
yeah.
no two ways about it, right? And so
Yeah.
if our brain and brain tissue is created of molecules, it only makes sense that electromagnetic radiation would impact on the tissue.
Have some influence, right?
Now the question is to what degree and how bad it is,
Right.
but what do we do to minimize that? So for example, what my wife does, and she spends like probably 10 hours on the phone every day or something.
Yeah.
She's using a headset. So the idea is keep the phone wired headset.
Distance is your friend.
So keep the phone as far away from the brain as possible. Is that good? And if not,
no, that's very good. There are better strategies like not use your phone. But anyway, let me just expand a bit on the reason why the brain is such an important organ. I mean, with respect to EMF, it's not these molecules, it's actually the voltage-gated calcium channels I referenced earlier. And the density of these channels are really highest in neurological tissue, specifically the brain, and in the pacemaker cells of your heart, which is why the heart is so susceptible, and also in the the reproduction organs. So those are the three organs that seems to be affected most. So what are the consequences of that? Alzheimer's, dementia, neuropsychiatric disorders like depression and anxiety, ADD, autism. So these are all conditions that are radically increasing because of the exposure to EMF. So, and I want to get back at some point to the free radicals, because it's really a central, important part of helping of really understanding the reason why this is so important. It's complex. It's a bit complex, and I'm glad we have the luxury of a little more time to go into some more detail. But we can skip over to answer your question now is what can you do? So yes, distance is your friend. Put it on cell phones. Put it on speaker, ideally. I mean, you can use a long cord, but speakerphone is free, right? Every phone is a speaker. Now, sometimes you're going to need privacy, so then you need the other one. But the key that most people mess up on, and I regularly lecture to, large groups, and I ask everyone to pull their cell phone. And almost invariably, almost everyone doesn't have it in airplane mode, and they're pulling it out of their pocket. And these are sharp people. I mean, I've lectured some pretty educated audiences, and they don't understand that the last thing you want to do, unless you have some type of emergency, because nothing's written in stone, but you never really want to put your phone on your body unless it's in airplane mode. You're causing too much. And most people, the men, they put in their suit coat pocket. They got it right over their heart. It's like, what are you doing? Or put in their hip pocket, So you don't want to, that's the first thing you can do. The other is, much of the damage is enhanced if you're exposed to it while you're resting and repair. So while you're sleeping. So a simple thing you can do is turn the Wi-Fi off at night. That's a start. A more aggressive intervention, the one I recommend, is to actually get rid of the Wi-Fi and have no Wi-Fi in your house and convert to wired. What you have to do is contact a home theater company. They can come in and run the wires for you. You get some adapters for your notebooks and other devices, and then you can avoid the wireless, because people think that the EMF is coming from outside, but most of it's inside. That Wi-Fi router in your house is producing about 10 times the EMF exposure than a cell phone tower would be if it was right outside your window. Mm-hmm. So, and they don't realize that they have control. Fortunately, they have control over it. They can, avoid it. So those are the big ones, and there's many, many, many more that we can go into great detail.
And we got a little sidetracked here, so I want to go back to nutrition, or start with nutrition. But I was reading actually a bunch of studies which were saying that guys usually put their laptops on their lap.
Yeah.
And then they were doing all those studies where they measure sperm count, before and after you spend a couple of hours with your laptop on your lap. And ever since then, luckily for me, I don't use a laptop, but when I do, now I usually put like a thick pillow, and I even put like another, like I have these mats,
distance.
Wooden mats that
I
put on top of the pillow, so I try to insulate myself.
Well, you can put some aluminum foil there, which will deflect pretty well. But the even better is to have an Ethernet adapter in your USB port, and then connect to a wired Ethernet connection, and then and put it in airplane mode. So it's only causing a problem on your lap because it's emitting the EMFs. I mean, there's some EMFs from the battery, but it's pretty low. So the biggest exposure is not in airplane mode. And if you have an airplane mode, putting it in your lap is not as much of an issue.
And it's funny how, none of the manufacturers measure or release any data on the sort of the level
But
of radiation that
we don't have to rely on it. These devices are relatively inexpensive. You can get a meter that is the one there's many meters, and I have thousands of dollars worth of meters to do these measurements. But the one I like the best, because it's simple and relatively inexpensive, is called Acousticom 2, like acoustic, and then Com 2. The only problem is it's really hard to find. It's on Amazon, and you can pick it up for like $150. So, and it doesn't measure all of them. It just measures the radio frequencies and the important ranges, which is probably the most significant exposure that people have control over. So, and it will certainly measure your laptop. So you don't have, it doesn't matter what the manufacturer say. It's trust, even what they told you what it was, you have to verify it, right? You have to independently, objectively assess what the numbers are.
Right. I agree with that. Now, let's shift back our attention to something which we have a lot more control of, perhaps,
Sure.
which is to say our lifestyle and our nutritional choices. Now, first of all, there's this discussion, and I want to get your opinion on this. People have this opinion. So I'm a cyclist, so I bike with a bunch of buddies, and we bike, we do like 80 or 100K, and then we finish at the end of the day, and I see somebody stuffing like 4 hot dogs or stuffing a big pizza or loading up on alcohol with the pizza and all kinds of stuff. And their argument is, look, I just burned like 3,000 calories, okay? It's fine. My body is burning it. So in other words, they're saying if you work out as they are, very actively, then nutrition is not so important or is secondary to working out. So where is the priority ranking between these two? Which is more important, nutrition or exercise?
Well, there's no question nutrition is significantly more important. You've got to, not to diminish the value of exercise. That was one of my initial interests in why I went into medicine. Initially, it was through exercise. And we know now some of the mechanisms. Primarily, exercise does so many darn good things, but one of the most important benefits for exercise is it activates a pathway called PGC1 alpha, which is a subset of PPAR gamma and alpha, actually gammas. And what this does, it has a number of functions, but it increases mitochondrial biogenesis. So as our cells become damaged through oxidative stress and improper diet, they become, and mitochondria, they become defective. So we have to replace those, and exercise will help do that very effectively. So, but the justification that exercise does allow you a little leeway, and that you can get away with a lot more sugar during the time you're exercising, because you'll burn it as fuel rather than convert it to fat or oxidative stress. So it won't raise your insulin levels as high if you do consume when you're exercising. It's not to say it's a great idea, but you can get away with it and not suffer as a result. So, and the response that your friends are giving you is probably valid in the short term. It's not going to make a big difference, but over the long term, it depends on what their goals are. Because it's hard to argue with someone who has a goal of athletic performance, and there's been studies that show that a high percentage of people, if given the choice of taking a drug that would kill them in a few years, but they would allow them to win the world championship, they would take it in a heartbeat. I mean, that's just human nature, right? So, but if your goal is longevity and health and decreased risk of disease, then you have different choices to optimize that. And so, they can have the hot dogs and they can have the Coke, but especially if you're choosing foods that are full of toxins, and most processed foods are, they accumulate in your fat cells, and then eventually over time they'll contribute to premature aging and disease.
Yeah, usually the cycling popular things are, let's say you stop for a coffee, and quite often it comes with like a cake or something like that when we take a break, right? And the cake is usually dough and sugar and stuff like that, and it's considered fuel for cyclists, right?
Yeah. Well, the worst thing in that cake, though, is really the bad fat they use, because almost all pastries are made with industrially processed vegetable oils, which are far worse than the sugar, because they get embedded in your cell membranes, and it's really they're there for a long time until a cell dies.
Very good. So let's see how we can approach this whole thing. So first of all,
oh, by the way, before you go to the next question,
yeah.
just a point of recommendation is you may, if indeed and I suspect it is, your health is a really important priority for you, you may want to reconsider cycling, because not that it's not a good exercise, but if you're on the road, your risk to reward ratio becomes relatively high, because you can get hit by a car and killed, you can fall off and get traumatic brain injury. So there's far safer ways to get your exercise. But I love cycling. You have to do it in a safe environment.
Yeah, I agree, and I actually have been in a couple of car accidents, and which is why I don't go downtown anymore. I used to go to university for 5 years every day by bicycle, and once a week I would have a near miss scenario.
Yeah,
and I was thinking, I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years now, doing my undergraduate. One day it's not going to be a near miss. And
it doesn't have to be your fault. It could be some knucklehead who didn't sleep all night and was texting, and boom, you're dead.
And I ended up with like 5 stitches in my eyebrow. My front of the bike got pummeled, like all kinds of things. And the moral of the story for me in that case was, first, I'm buying a helmet.
Yeah.
Which is a must, I discovered. That was many years ago. And of course, that happened right after my conversation with my wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, telling me you never have a helmet. And I was answering like a stubborn European. Look, I grew up on a bicycle. We didn't have helmets when I was a kid. I never knew anyone ever having trouble. And of course, the very next day after this conversation, I get into a car accident, like hit by a car. I have 5 stitches in my eyebrow, and then I go and I buy myself the best helmet I can buy.
Yeah, there are even better helmets that are essentially like airbags that inflate, which would help somewhat. But the big problem with falling is not so much the superficial injuries, which repair real easily, but the trauma to the brain, which can give you massive problems. And you could do these QEEGs that will objectively document where the trauma is. And there are repair strategies you can do, like neurofeedback, but it definitely messes you up long term. And
yeah, I suffered for about maybe somewhere between 3 and 6 months with all kinds of post-concussive syndrome issues and strong headache, sensitivity to light, all kinds of problems consequently. It took me like over 6 months before I was able to sort of get back on track. So I agree with the risks about cycling in general.
Yeah. Well, just so you know, I mean, everyone gets a choice, but it's, if you're playing the odds, it's not a good odd one to take. Good one to choice, I think.
I agree, but I just love it too much.
Yeah, I know. It's a magnificent.
So now I just try to go in a safe direction if I can, outside of the city and to like farm roads and stuff like that. Anyway, so by the way, let me do one last small little digression for my own sort of indulgence, and then we finally jump right in. But you said you've listened to a number of my podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
How did that happen, and why? How did you discover me? What did you find interesting? I was shocked and surprised to find that out.
Yeah, I don't remember the specific details how I did, but I was intrigued with some of your guests. I remember seeing the D-Wave founders that you interviewed and some other people. And, I don't think you've been interviewing that many people recently. It seems like you've been on a hiatus, but I one of the reasons my website's so successful is I understood early on the value of RSS feeds, and I still use them. So if I find someone interesting, I'll put them in my feed, and then I'll at least look at the first few minutes of something. So I listen through I would say 2 to 4 hours of podcast a day. Right now I'm listening to Exponential Medicine from Singularity University. They just had that last week, and I don't have to go there. They put 40 hours of video online. So I'm listening to that. So I like your courage and taking all the arrows and you've done some pretty brave things, and I really loved your position you took, and you got a lot of flack for it about Singularity University and challenges that gauntlet you threw down to them. I don't think they've done any changes since then, but it was very good.
Thank you. Yeah, that cost me a lot in a number of different ways, but it was good, and I don't regret it.
Yeah, I respect you for that. Thank
you. I could have done it better, of course. Now looking back at it, I'm thinking I did a terrible job at the delivery and everything, but I just did the best at the time. So
yeah.
Anyway, So let's talk about the optimum human diet and then potentially all the supplements and
Hmm.
then lifestyle.
Hmm.
So is there any such thing as optimal human diet? Because many people say, well, look, Nick, you say that the best thing you've done for yourself is to be plant-based for the past 3 years almost or whatnot, but it
Hmm.
doesn't work for me. And then other people say,
No.
well, for me, the paleo thing works the best.
Okay,
Uh,
well, I get your point. Here's the issue. Here's the answer. Yes, there is an optimum human diet. But you know what? It varies for everyone. So it depends. So yeah, there's some basic principles. I think plant-based is a great start. I is if you're exclusively plant-based, I think that can run into some problems. I can mention 4 or 5 things why it would be, but normally I think that it's a good strategy. And I'm primarily mostly plant-based, almost all plant-based, and I think plants are enormously beneficial. But it depends. I mean, I've interviewed Dr. Stephen Gundry, who wrote the book The Plant Paradox, that discusses all the damage of lectins of people and their contribution to autoimmune disease. So you have to be careful. And how do you be careful? Well, you can see what your genetics and your metabolomics shows, and there are a number of different ways you can do that. You can analyze your DNA, and there's a number of companies that do that, and then you can take those results, which only tell you the likelihood that you might have a problem, but that you can integrate it with a test called organic acid test. And I like Great Plains, the urine organic acid test. And you combine those two tests, and then you can see exactly what's going on to see if, in fact, you're deficient in some B vitamins or you have way too much protein. So it really depends. I mean, you get some basic things. Everyone has to optimize insulin resistance. No one gets a pass on that. But some people can tolerate a lot more carbs than others. So you just measure your insulin, and as a screen, and if you're good, or if you can able to generate ketones, which is another good tool. I think everyone should be metabolically flexible and have the ability to burn fat or sugar, whichever they need. Most people cannot burn fat effectively; they're impaired. I would say that's probably 85% of the population, which is why they're insulin resistant.
Mhm.
So, there's a wide range. There is no perfect diet for everyone. That's impossible. But I think there's great principles that apply to almost everyone.
Okay, so let's start breaking that down apart. So first of all, what are the most common mistakes
Mm-hmm.
that people screw up on a regular basis on the mass scale? Let's say,
Okay.
give
Well,
me
you're
the
talking
top,
about the general population,
yes,
not
give me the
uh,
top three most popular things that people screw up.
probably the top three. All right, is number one is processed food. Number two is processed food. Number three is processed food. It's that important. Why? Because everything's in there. All the bad things. It's full of toxins. It's full of denatured, pernicious fats, which get embedded in your membranes, industrially processed fats. Far too many excessive carbohydrates, and they're processed. They're taken away from their fibers. So it's the alternative isn't simple or necessarily inexpensive because it does take time. But someone, either you or someone you love or pay, has to prepare the food from scratch. So that is it. You make your own food. And I guess a subset of processed food would be restaurants. Maybe that's two or three, because people think, you have virtually no control. And I am acknowledging that there are some incredible restaurants that are better than almost anyone can make at home. But those are the rare exception. Almost all of them are terrible. They're using these industrially processed oils. They have to make a profit, so their intention is to make it tasty and not necessarily nutritionally valuable for you. So minimize it to as much as you can the time that you're eating out at a restaurant or at a conference. I was just at a conference last weekend, and these were really high-level, profoundly effective integrative physicians. And they had served lunch, but the lunch was from the hotel, and they were serving the same darn stuff. So here's the other mistake: is that if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. It is not a mystery that you go to this conference at around noon or dinner, you're going to want to eat lunch or dinner, right? So no, you're going, so you can bring some of your own food. Like in my case, I bring sunflower seed sprouts. I bring canned sardines. which are a healthy form of protein, and I don't have the chicken that they serve there for free. I just take out my sardines, I know I have a healthy form of protein and healthy fat. So I think
So
that's
let
it.
me get
Molecular
this right.
planning.
You
Yeah,
go to this medical conference,
I
you
know
serve
it's
lunch, everyone else of your colleagues is eating chicken, and you
yeah.
take out your can of sardines?
Oh, I do it all the time. Or I'll go to, a lot of times they'll have these banquets, with some of these fancy events, and I stop eating after 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay. Here's the other component. Okay, how can I miss? So processed food, restaurants. Uh, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And here's the other one. The timing of the food is almost all wrong. 90%. It's not just what you eat, it's when you eat. And who is talking about when you eat? Virtually no one, right? So 90% of the public, and this is data popularized by Sachin Panda, who's an investigator at USC. He wrote the book, The Circadian Clock, or Your Circadian Code. And 90% of the public, of Americans at least, eat outside of a 12-hour window. So they're eating more than 12 hours a day. 90%. I think it's healthy to compress your eating window to 6 to 8 hours, to have these long periods where you're resting your digestive system and allowing rest and recovery to occur. And really not maximally, but at least mildly stimulating autophagy and activating your stem cells. So when you're eating, one of the worst mistakes you can make is eating right before you go to bed. That is just and then forget the food. I don't care if it's the healthiest food on the planet. You shouldn't eat before you go to bed most of the time. Now that conflicts with many people's who are working. They work till 5, they get home at 6, maybe 7, they have a meal with their family. And I am not diminishing the importance of social connection with your family or friends. I mean, that is key, but you don't have to eat. You can eat earlier and you can still stay together and do whatever you would do when you were eating. So I think that's the big one, is that people are not paying attention to the timing of their food.
Mm-hmm. So, okay. So basically the three takeaways were processed food, like
/restaurants, right?
Like restaurants, for example. Then we have the circadian rhythm, which is to say the timing of the food, and the idea is to compress it more and more into a shorter period of time, so that you have a longer period of time in between the first and the last meal, or between the last meal of the last day and the first meal of the next day.
Right.
And what was the second one?
If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail.
Right.
So, because
can of sardines or whatever it takes to be
right.
prepared.
And that extends to, okay, I'm going to make a commitment to prepare my own food. Then you've got to figure that out and have the stuff in the refrigerator, and, and order it or whatever. So you have everything on hand. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. You're going to go to McDonald's.
All right. So we got that sort of general idea. And then let me ask you then about some of the food groups here, and let's talk about the good and the bad parts of it. So let's start with something that you're kind of an expert in, you've written books about and stuff, which is to say fat. Mm-hmm. Which are the bad fats and which are the good fats? Which fats should people consume and which fats should people stay?
Well, I'll tell you the one that's not an argument. No one's going to say that industrially processed vegetable oils are good for you. And then trans fat is to be a subset of that. So you just should avoid them like the plague. They are not to be consumed.
No doubt about
that. And even there's a confusion on this, even with health people literate in health would be perceived healthy oils like flaxseed oil. So when I lecture, I usually ask who's got flaxseed oil at home. Then I ask them to think of a friend or relative they don't like and give it to them, because it's a processed oil. Even though it's a healthy oil, it's still processed. So when it's first processed, it's healthy, but through time, it's highly perishable and oxidizes and becomes essentially rancid, and you do not want to consume that. So you can have flaxseed oil, but you consume it in the whole seed. So you soak your seeds overnight, put them in your smoothie, and you're good to go. And it's less expensive and it's much healthier for you. So those are so those are the bad fats. And then an excess of omega. Most of the essential fats are omega-6 and omega-3. But even though they're essential, it's really, really hard. You almost have to be an IV parenteral nutrition to become deficient in omega-6 because it's so pervasive in our environment. It's like impossible, almost impossible to get deficient on. So really the primary ones we get deficient on omega-3s. And so that would be things like flaxseed oil or hemp or chia, which is an ALA omega-3. And then higher uh, carbon fats, which would be EPA and DHA. And those are marine oils typically. You can get from algae or fish or seafood, essentially.
Krill and sardines.
Krill and sardines are two ones that I particularly like. I don't eat a lot of sardines unless I'm traveling. So
okay, so we kind of talked about a little bit about some of the bad fats and some of the good fats. Give me some more examples. And for example,
well, we talked about the bad fats. We didn't talk about the good fats yet.
Right. Go ahead. So tell us about those.
Well, there is controversy about saturated fat, but there isn't controversy about the non-saturated fat, the monos and the omega-3s. So those would be things like the marine oils and then flax, omega-3s. So those are good. So other healthy fats that I think are useful are like coconut oil, which would be a saturated fat, but it's a short chain, it's medium chain actually. And then avocados, nuts, seeds. I like macadamia nuts the best because they're the highest in fat, the lowest in protein, lowest in carbs. So pretty nutrient dense from that perspective. And the primary fatty acid in macadamia nuts is oleic acid, which is the same thing in olive oil. Now, olive oil has some other benefits that macadamia nuts doesn't, but that's the primary fat. So it's a monounsaturated fat, omega-9. So those are the primary ones, seeds, nuts.
Let me share with you part of sort of my experience because as you may be aware, about 2.5 to 3 years ago, a little less than 3 years, I transitioned to a plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like I'm doing it sort of the scientific method. Every 5 or 6 months, I go and I do a full blood profile. I do a bunch of tests and we see where we are. And then I have a nutritionist and we do a bunch of changes. And, it's not like I got it right. It's not that I got it right now. All I can say is that right now my blood picture looks better than it's been for the last 15 or 20 years. But it's not perfect yet, but it's better than it's ever been. Now, but here's what happened with me. So I sort of became plant-based cold turkey, like overnight. We just opened up the fridge with my wife one day, gave away all the cheese, the butter, the meat, everything we had there, and we became plant-based. And we will talk about some of the dangers that you would foresee with things like that and supplementations and so on a little later. But what happened was my cholesterol started exploding after I became vegan or plant-based. Okay. And I could not figure it out for the longest time. So basically, instead, I stopped eating butter, milk, cheese, which I used to eat tons of meat, all those things. And yet my cholesterol started exploding, exactly the opposite what I would have presumed. And I was like, what the hell is going wrong? And it turns out, or at least in my case, what was happening was I was loading everything with coconut oil. So I would cook everything in coconut oil. I would make myself a shake once a day, and I would put a generous spoonful of coconut oil and all kinds of things. And the moment I actually removed the coconut oil completely, first my cholesterol dropped very substantially, and then on the next test, it was already in the normal range.
Yeah. All right. So with respect to your experience with coconut oil, I think there's some confusion because you're relying on total cholesterol as a reflection of an increased risk for heart disease, and it's not, even though a lot of people think it is. It's a mistake. So you have to look at the fractions, like the HDL, the cholesterol ratio, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, the small particle size for the LDLs. Those numbers got worse, and they very well could have. I'm not saying they didn't, but you can't look at total.
Triglycerides particularly went really bad.
Okay, so that's typically a good sign that it was going in the wrong direction, because triglycerides are a simple way to analyze the scenario without doing more sophisticated.
They were worst that we've ever measured.
Okay. Yeah. How high they get? Like a thousand or?
Well, I have the numbers here in my computer. I forget, but and also, by the way, it turns out I was watching. We in Canada have a little bit different measurement of cholesterol than you guys in the States, for some reason. So here it's measured like up to a scale of 6 or something, and then we break it down in triglycerides and HDL, LDL, and then sort of permanent cholesterol or something. I forget what the other one is called, but it's on a measure of 6. And in the States, isn't it like 100 and some units or something, like 140 or below or above or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. So they use different units in
Right. So we
Canada.
measure it differently in Canada, as it
Okay.
turns
All
out.
right. Well, we won't go there. But so the thing is, coconut oil is notorious for raising cholesterol, and sometimes that's useful. Like in my case, I have like 4 ounces of coconut oil a day because my cholesterol is too low. I mean, it typically runs about 110 to 120. So I can get up to 130, 140 with 4 ounces of cholesterol. So again, the earlier answer was you need to optimize the diet for yourself individually. So in your case, that was not a good choice. So there is no right or wrong answer. And you were still eating plant-based. That was not animal fat. That was plant-based fat.
Yeah, but
But in your case, it was not a good fat for you.
yeah, and I was
Or you had
probably
too much. You had too much of it.
yeah, I had too much of it, and I actually removed it completely after that, and now it's been all into the normal range. My
Yeah, yeah.
triglycerides have dropped. My doctor was shocked that I was able to do that. I have a 78-year-old doctor who thinks he can never learn anything ever again. He thinks he's seen everything for the
Yeah.
last 50 years, 60 years, and he was telling me this is never going to change with your diet only and this and that. And when my numbers started dropping and then eventually went into the normal range, he was like, wow, this is really impressive. And you're sure you haven't taken any statins or anything? I was like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure.
Well, sadly, that's the rule rather than the exception. Most physicians don't really crack open a book to learn new things after they graduate and take their last certification exam, which is sad commentary, but that's the reality. So,
Right. So anyway, so it goes to your point that not, you know, there's no one sort of silver bullet for all of us, perhaps, even if it's plant-based, and also goes to go into the direction to say that even if it's a plant-based fat, it doesn't necessarily make it good, because
mhm.
it could be processed plant-based, very bad, or in my case, coconut oil was also pretty bad. So now tell me, what are the so-called good animal-based fats in your view?
Well, again, it's the same situation, whether it's a plant or animal. It's sort of a mood issue. I don't think animal-based fat is necessarily a requirement. It's mostly the animal proteins that some people need, and not necessarily large amounts. And it doesn't have to be meat. It could be fish and could be eggs. But I need there's that have some sources of uh, not only phosphatidylcholine, but which eggs is the biggest nutritional source of, and that's a really important nutrient that most people are deficient in, especially plant-based people. Um, but vitamin B12, I mean, so that's one that's typically in animal food. So, and I don't know the concentrations in different meats, but if you're a menstruating woman, then iron would be an issue. It isn't for men; it's actually the counter. So, one of the benefits of being an adult, of a plant-based and an adult male, is that you can lower your iron levels, and iron is really a pernicious risk factor that's stealth that virtually no physicians understand or appreciate,
You know,
and it increases oxidative stress.
the interesting thing is that my iron actually went up since I went vegan. And it's very, very optimally perfect right now. We've measured it over time, and that's another thing which my doctor got surprised, because basically his thing when he found out that I'm gonna be plant-based, he said, "You're gonna be iron deficient, calcium deficient, protein
No,
deficient, and you're
no,
going to
for
die
you,
very soon."
no, that's just not true. So, uh, but they didn't measure the right do the right test to measure iron sufficiency. So that is called ferritin, Ferritin. And I think that the units are the same in Canada as it is in the US. And it should be lower than 40 nanograms per deciliter, I believe is the unit. And most men are over 100, and that's problematic, and that will increase oxidative stress. So the same genetic disease I have that lowers my cholesterol actually increases my iron risk, so, or iron level. So I have to be particularly watchful of that, and I'm able to keep my ferritin levels under 40. So that's what you have to measure. And then you can also measure oxidative stress, and you probably know this already with high sensitivity CRP protein.
Right.
You can measure DNA damage with 2-deoxyguanosine. I think 2-DA. That's maybe not the correct term, but it's a DNA marker of oxidative damage. Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this then. What's your take on this whole plant-based sort of lifestyle, which seems to be exploding everywhere right now? Some people say it's the fastest growing social movement. So putting the ethical and the social issues to the side, which are very important, actually. Mm-hmm. Let's put them to the side. Look at it from purely health point of view. Is it possible or is it not possible to remain healthy on a plant-based diet?
Well, it depends what your definition of plant-based is. Is it exclusively plant with no animal foods at all?
Yeah.
So vegan you're talking about?
Pretty much, yeah.
Not a vegetarian.
Vegan meaning whole plant-based, no cheese, no egg, no milk, no butter.
No fish.
No fish.
Okay, so I don't think it is. I think it's impossible, physiologically impossible. I can, with Y supplementation, you can circumvent that. So things like B12, carnosine, phosphatidylcholine, those would be some of the main ones. So you have to address the deficiencies, and it doesn't really matter as long as you're assessing your individual profile. So you can measure these levels. You can use tools like chronometer.com, CRONOMETR.com. It's free. You can enter your foods in and see where your levels come up. It's well documented. So it's not rocket science, really. There's certain nutrients you need. And if you're not getting them regularly from the food you eat, it's a problem. Now, what people who aren't eating plant-based, they have to go in the opposite direction. They essentially have overnutrition and the wrong food. They have a surplus of calories and not getting the micronutrients that they need. But plant-based people tend not to have that. They tend to have to be relatively low in protein, which I think is healthy. If you're just relying on plants, where plants are relatively less protein dense than animal foods, a lot less protein dense, which I think is a good thing, as I said, because most people overeat protein.
So then what are the sort of the most common dangers that people like me who are committed to a plant-based diet are going to face? You mentioned B12. Yeah. What else?
Carnosine would be another one. And then, which is a nutrient you need for muscle growth. And then also phosphatidylcholine is typically deficient in vegans. And that's a really important nutrient. You need to process toxins out of your liver and pass them into the bile, and has a wide variety of other needs for your body. And typically, especially if you're doing strength training, or you eat a lot of fat, your needs are going to be increased. So,
yeah, I eat a lot of avocados and a lot of nuts and things like
that. That's good, but those don't have B12, carnosine, or phosphatidylcholine.
Right, B12 originates in algae, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's in a form that's not absorbed very well. Fortunately, that's an easy thing to resolve. I mean, literally, it's really inexpensive and it's simple to do. And there's non-vegan B12 supplements. So
I do supplement with B12 for sure.
Yeah, because I mean, neurodegenerative disease from B12 deficiency is a reality, and people can go blind from that. So
right, we measure my B12
every time I simple to do.
And it's not optimum yet. It's good. But so my doctor is happy with it. My nutritionist is not. She says that the doctor's measure is way too low.
I'd probably believe your nutritionist.
Yeah. And so she says she wants to get it a lot more optimized.
Yeah.
So I've increased actually as of recently my dosage of B12 supplementation. But isn't that the case also for meat eaters? I think that also meat eaters generally suffer from low B12 on average.
Well, they can, and it depends if they have a genetic SNP for it too, and because B12 is connected with folate, not folic acid necessarily. So if you have a SNP for that, it can be problematic. But doesn't necessarily mean that the answer is to throw on lots of methylfolate and methyl B12, which is the better form of B12 rather than cyanocobalamin. So you have to measure and you have to look at it. You can't guess.
Right, absolutely. And the other two things that you mentioned, what are the sources or the origins of those substances? Because I admit I'm not familiar with them.
For phosphatidylcholine.
Yes.
Well, it's mostly animal-based foods. So the largest one in the American diet would be egg yolks, not egg whites, but egg yolks, which has quite a bit, actually. 3 egg yolks a day would probably be sufficient. I'd encourage you to seriously reconsider adding some fish and eggs into your diet, which, I mean, it obviously have to be high quality and very small fish. And the eggs would have to be produced by chickens who were raised ethically and not abused and given bad food. So, and that's relatively easy to do. You can even grow them yourself. So, but that would probably be enough to compensate for all the nutritional deficiencies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I see.
And so it's like a pescatarian essentially. Those are the only things you need. You never have to eat meat. I mean, you can get away without eating meat and still be very, very healthy, as long as you have a little bit of animal protein and animal fat. So the fat, the key animal fat would be the one in egg yolk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, butter has some benefits too. It has vitamin A. Vitamin A can be a problem in vegetarians because it's a fat-soluble vitamin. It's not made in plants. Beta carotene is, and your body converts it, but the conversion rate is relatively maybe inadequate to have high or healthy concentrations of retinol or vitamin A.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so because I personally subjectively feel myself that I'm better than I've been in many years.
I'm sure you are. Yeah.
How could I measure scientifically, perhaps, what would be the symptoms, those substances you say, or what's
B12.
the measure that I'm deficient? No, so B12 I measure, I know about all of that. I'm supplementing.
Yeah, carnosine, I'd have to look it up because, I normally don't have these types of extensive arguments. So I just know that's an issue. And I think you can measure phosphatidylcholine, or you can measure choline levels. You could take choline as a supplement, but I think it's better to take phosphatidylcholine. So I think that probably the best test for you is, and I can make a recommendation for a clinician to review the results with you, would be the Great Plains urine organic acid test, and combined with the genomic evaluation. So in understanding your SNPs and your predispositions, and then looking what your specific metabolism is doing can be a great insight. Especially if you combine it with a detox panel. They measure like about 120 different common toxin exposures. It's a simple test. You just restrict some supplements for a few days and you urinate into a jar and mail it in. It's nothing crazy, not terribly inexpensive, but not overly outrageous. I think it's under 1,000. So even both of those.
Let me ask you this, because you mentioned the SNPs. I've done my 23andMe.
Yeah, you could use that data. You can send it in. They can use that, so you don't have to repeat that test.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah, for those who haven't done 23andMe, I wouldn't recommend it because privacy is a big issue nowadays, as I'm sure you're well aware of. And once you do 23andMe, you're not private unless you give them an alias name and information, so they can't connect it to you, because they sell it to the drug companies and all that. That's why they're able to subsidize that test.
My understanding is that because I interviewed.
I know they have a privacy policy now, but if you didn't sign it before, it was sold.
Yeah, I did mine many years ago.
Yeah, so your data is in a lot of drug companies. That's what they're doing. They're generating data for industry. So it's a clever model, actually, pretty clever. But you lose your privacy as a consequence.
All right. So let me see. What about the single or best food that we can all eat? Is there any such thing? And if there's one or two foods like that, what would you recommend?
No, it's just the same issue with the single best. I can name really healthy foods, but there's no single best food. I think eggs are actually pretty high up there. I like krill oil as a source of healthy nutrition, because it's actually even higher in phosphatidylcholine. Half of krill oil is phospholipids, and the other is EPA and DHA, which you need, but it's in a form that's particularly well absorbed and penetration in the brain. And Rhonda Patrick, who's a really good biological scientist, just recently wrote a paper how that's particularly useful protecting those who have ApoE4 allele, which is an increased risk for Alzheimer's. So I like krill oil. I like chlorella. I take about 10 grams of chlorella a day, fermented chlorella that we provide. because it's full of chlorophyll and can actually help some of the proteins in there can bind to toxins like mercury. So it's good for helping you excrete metals. I think that's it does, actually, I chew it. It doesn't taste that bad. It tastes pretty good. I like it. Makes your teeth green a bit, but it's helpful. So, and that's vegan based, of course. Chlorella. It's a little algae. So those are some of the better ones. And then sprouts. I think sprouts are massive. I'm really focusing on phytochemicals now, and I'm looking at a lot of the cruciferous sprouts that are high in glucosinolates. And when you eat them, or you take an enzyme called myrosinase, it converts the glucosinolate to an isothiocyanate like sulforaphane that has been, this massively important properties. It radically reduces inflammation. It's really useful to get rid of malignant cancer cells. So I have a seed smoothie that I actually sprout about a dozen different seeds for 5 days. And then at day 5 or 6 or 7, I'll put it up in my NutriBullet and add a bunch of other nutrients. And so I pretty much, and on strength training days, I'll use a little whey protein, but other than that, it's pretty much all plant-based. And I like it's hard to build muscles, although I know a lot of people will provide examples of vegan bodybuilders, and I know they exist. But that's not the case for most people because you really need like the branched chain amino acids to serve as a substrate to activate the pathways to build muscles. And they're not really high in plant-based foods. So whey happens to be one of the highest. Or you could take a supplement like branched chain amino acids or leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So.
Interesting. Okay, and so let me ask you about a couple of supplements, perhaps, and you can tell me whether they would be good ideas or not, and then we'll move on to a little bit to longevity rather than just
sure.
So, what about things like vitamin D, for example? Should we be supplementing with that?
Well, you probably should. I have not taken vitamin D for over 10 years, maybe 12 years now. I live in Florida, and I make sure that I'm outside, for a substantial amount of time. And I just had my blood tested last week, and it was 70 nanograms per ml. Per deciliter? No, per ml. And your units are different, so it'd be 2.5. So that would be like 150, 160 in your unit system. So the ideal way to get it, we could talk for an hour about this, but the ideal way is to get it from the sun, not from a pill. Because you get other benefits when you expose your skin to the sun, such as UVA, which causes the release of nitric oxide. And then 40% of the sun rays are near infrared. You can activate your mitochondrial cytochromes, at least 2 of them, to become more efficient at producing ATP when you expose in near infrared, and the sun's the least expensive way to do it. So you can get it for free. I don't think you should pay for vitamin D, although it's an inexpensive supplement. But if you, for whatever reason, have chose to live in a frigid climate really far north like you have, then that's a problem, and you're going to need probably the lesser of 2 levels of vitamin D. But vitamin D is just a marker for sun exposure. That's why when you read these epidemiological studies that show all these benefits, such as reduced autoimmunity diseases like type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, decreased cancer risk, it's not because the people were necessarily taking high levels of vitamin D supplements. It's because they were getting sun exposure that caused it to go up. So it's catalyzing all these beneficial biological changes. So, but you'll get some benefit clearly by taking vitamin D. So you want to keep it in healthy levels, so for sure, vitamin D. But try to get the sun.
I do my best,
I know.
Monitor our system here. The way it works is like vitamin D is one of those that I actually have to pay for whatever reason to test. And
that's great.
I'm actually paying for it. And
how much do you charge you? How much do you charge you?
I think it was $60.
Okay, yeah, that's a reasonable rate. Yeah,
something like that, maybe $55, $60. But mine was not optimal. Mine was like just a little bit above the minimum, which kind of shocked me because.
Well, it depends on what their levels are, because most of them are using the wrong reference ranges. They're normal reference ranges, not healthy reference ranges. So, right, exactly. You really. The American one, it should be between 60 and 80, and if your units, you have to multiply that by 2.5. So that would be 130 to whatever. Yeah, just do the math. And it usually requires about 8,000 units of vitamin D. That's the only source of vitamin D.
Yeah, we have this kind of ongoing thing. My doctor, everything that's not off the chart of the normal range for him is fine. Whereas then when I go to my nutritionist,
Right.
she looks at it and she's like, "That's fine because it means it's not out of the range, but it's not fine because you're just above it. So that's not fine. You need to
Right.
do
Yeah.
a
You
lot
need to
better."
stop seeing your doctor. Although you end up, yeah, we really, or find a new one. Uh, he doesn't get it. I mean, there are integrative physicians in Canada, although it may be a bit of a challenge.
He's
I know
he's
a number of Canadian physicians. So.
he's a good guy actually, and the good thing about him is that he's semi-retired and he lets me test for everything that I ever want,
Okay. Well, that's fine. So
without.
as long as
So
you're in
so
control.
basically, I've outsourced all those decisions to me and to my nutritionist, and
Okay.
basically go
Good.
to
Good.
him and I say, "Can I please get such and such
Okay.
taken
Good. As
place
long as he's
first?"
not putting you in dangerous territory, that's good.
Right. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about perhaps life extension, and some of the things that we can or we could or we shouldn't do on that topic. Now, a particular subset of my audience, for example, I know are practicing intermittent fasting or even fasting in general for a more prolonged period of times. What's
Mhm.
your take on intermittent fasting and or longer term fasting, like spanning several days, maybe even up to a week in some cases,
Yeah.
with respect to health and especially longevity?
Well, excellent question. In fact, I wrote a book about that. I just put in the draft for it 2 weeks ago. So it will be published in May. It's called Keto Fast. I think it's the best one out there, and it's really a hybrid from a different models. I used to believe at this time last year that long-term or multiple day water fasting was one of the most profoundly beneficial metabolic things you can do for your body. And why? Because it does some really great things. It increases autophagy, which is essentially Latin for or Greek for self-eating. So it destroys these subcellular parts that are damaged and are clogging up the system essentially. So it gets rid of those. Then it activates your stem cells, which is also useful. But what I didn't understand is that when you are, and no one should do water fast unless they are intermittent fasting for about a month, because you have that will, if you intermittent fast for a month, compress your window down to 6 to 8 hours, then you'll probably be metabolically flexible. Although you can test by measuring your ketones as long as they're above 0.5 millimoles. And Keto Mojo is probably the best way to do that because the strips are only $1. Keto, Keto Mojo, Mojo. And the downside that I didn't appreciate is that when you fast, you are burning fat. It's a process called lipolysis. And guess what's stored in your fat? Fat soluble toxins, which are released. So many of the side effects that people notice, and I've done multiple, maybe 4 or 5 day water fast. So it's not like I haven't tried it and not speaking from
So
experience.
let me just be specific in
Yeah,
defining. When you say water fast, you mean that for 5 days all you have is water?
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's helping now, and I've done it 5 times. So, and I'll tell you why. Because most people are going to experience side effects. Although I didn't really have any, although I think I lost too much weight, and I don't have a lot of weight to lose, so which is potentially problematic. So you can't do that extended periods of time. You can only do it a few times a year when you're way at your ideal weight or a little lower. So that's one issue. So the benefits that you're going to get, these autophagy and stem cell activations, are going to be limited because you can't do it that frequently. But if you do a partial fast, you could do that like once or twice a week. So, and then if you focus on pay attention to the important components of detoxification, which is supplying the nutrients your body needs to process those released fat soluble toxins to the liver, can make them water soluble and then further modify them so they can be easily excreted by the body. Then it becomes a easier process and less problematic for your body. You can actually excrete these toxins rather than resorbing them. So I think that it's a hybrid of the fasting mimicking diet work that Walter Longo has done out of USC. He's published a lot. He's probably the most prolific researcher on this, but I don't particularly care for his product that he sells, which is Prolon, which is a prepackaged system that it costs $50 a day, $50 a day to do. And it's the food probably costs maybe 25 or 50 cents. So you can do it yourself for a lot expensive, and you probably would get benefit of 5 days, but the partial fast, I think it's easier to do and safer. But if you, I set or focused on basically a 42-hour fast, and that essentially you're intermittent fasting for to compressed eating went up 6 to 8 hours. So for 18 hours, you're not eating. So you say you stop eating at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you start again at 9. So you've done that for a month. And at 9 o'clock on one day, your partial fasting day, you have like 300 to 600 calories, depending on how big you are. So for someone like me, it's 600, maybe 700 calories. And then I won't eat again for 24 hours. So in 42 hours, I've only eaten 600 calories. And I'll typically lose 5-6 pounds. And I definitely am burning fat. My ketones go through the roof. And that's when I do my detox protocol, which involves near, not far, near infrared sauna and some binders and a variety of other nutrients to facilitate excretion of these toxins.
So what's the bottom line of this? Is intermittent fasting better? Is it long-term fasting that's better?
No, I think you need both. I think the base is intermittent fasting. I'm convinced, I probably am wrong, but my current position is that most people would benefit from intermittent fasting. Now, I believe that long-term 18 hours. Yeah, but I thought chronic ketosis was useful too. So ketogenic diet. But I'm convinced that's unhealthy. That once you are able to become metabolically flexible, that you need to regularly increase the amount of carbohydrates and protein so that you're cycling in and out, not continuous ketosis. So it's the same way. I think you can cycle in and out of fasting. And it's interesting. You see your weight drop and then come back up, drop. It's kind of like heart rate variability, where you don't want the same heart rate all the time, right? You don't want the same weight all the time. You want to be able to fluctuate back and forth. I think that the value in cycling, it probably provides some powerful biological rejuvenation mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let me get this straight here. You said that you don't think that strict ongoing keto diet, whether it's in the sort of paleo sense or whether in the sort of keto
plant-based
sense,
doesn't matter.
Is good for the long term.
I mean, there might be some exceptions to that, but I think for the vast majority of people, it's problematic and dangerous, and I would not recommend or advise
What's the danger? What's the problem with that?
Well, there's a number of them. You can lose too much weight, and you actually see. They said earlier, 85% of people are insulin resistant. Well, you can become overly insulin sensitive. In other words, your insulin levels become so low that there's this paradox that occurs that you need insulin actually to stop the liver from making sugar. Because if your insulin level is too low, it doesn't stop it. So what does that mean? That means if you're chronic ketosis, your insulin level can theoretically go too low. And then what happens is that even though you're eating like no carbohydrates or less than 20 grams a day, your blood sugar starts to rise because your liver's making it. And here's the paradox. So you think, oh, I've got to reduce my carbohydrates even more. No, you have a piece of fruit, an orange or a healthy fruit, and maybe 20, 50, 70 grams of carbohydrates, boom, your blood sugar drops because you've stimulated insulin. Insulin's high. It shuts the liver production, or gluconeogenesis is called, of glucose, so that it goes down. So that's one issue. And it's only one. There's many hormonal problems. You can develop thyroid dysfunction, hypothyroidism. That's why you want to cycle in and out. I think you get sarcopenic. You can lose muscle mass. I mean, I'm sure there are some exceptions to this, and I'm sure there's people watching this who can say that they are it. But I think the long term because this has been studied for a long term. I mean, keto's been going on for 80 years, but it's primarily in seizure disorder, kids with seizure disorders. So the general population hasn't been doing that long, maybe just a few years at most.
Mm-hmm. What, in your view, are the best either food-related or supplement-related ways to promote longevity?
Great question. So I think it's cyclical ketogenesis, cycling in and out with a partial fast once or twice a week. And having lots of good, healthy plants and seeds. I've written my book, as I said, is Keto Fast, but there was a chapter that was too long and couldn't be fit into there. So if your readers or viewers would like a copy of that chapter, I'm happy to send it to them. All I have to do is send an email to media@mercola.com. And this chapter is still not done yet, so I'm not sure when it'll be completed, especially with the holidays coming up. But in that book, I go into about 20 different seeds, and there's like 400 or 500 references on this, and most of the references are within the last few years. So it's a lot of work went into this, and help people understand the value of these seeds and what the specific phytonutrients that are in there, and all the biological benefits that they have. So I'm a big believer in seeds, but not just swallow the seeds or crush them up. I mean, to sprout them and actually have a living food. So I think that if you talk about superfoods, sprouts are another superfood, but not just sunflower seed sprouts, but a whole variety. And I actually took training at Hippocrates Health Institute, which is plant-based, and that's where I learned how to sprout sunflower seeds. And they tend not to go into the seeds in the sprouting as much, as mostly like sunflower seeds and wheatgrass, but mostly beans, so those are the other primary ones. And I'm not sure that legume sprouts are as healthy, although I will have some mung bean sprouts too. But so sprouts, and sprouts have all these powerful phytochemicals in there that can supply your liver with the nutrients they need to break down or metabolize those fat soluble toxins when you're partial fasting, so that you can excrete them out of your body. Because, partial fasting, we did it just by chance because we didn't have access to food 24/7 100, 200 years ago like we do now. So it was part of our regular our regular lifestyle, and we didn't have to plan it. But now we can eat continuously our whole lives. It's possible and easy, actually, and convenient. And is there sort of interesting? Do you have a pet?
She died about a year ago.
Okay, and what was it, dog or cat?
Yorkshire Terrier.
Okay, cancer?
Well, she had a number of strokes in the end.
Okay, well, so cardiovascular disease. So most of us kill our pets not intentionally, and I'll tell you how. Because guess what? Just like your pets need to fast. So once a week or so, they will not like you for this, but once a week or you do not feed them, because you're going to activate the same biological mechanisms in your pets as you will in you. So that's why, the number one cause of death in pets is cancer. It's large part of that is the food that they're fed. They're almost all pet food is like more than half sugar, if you look at it. So they were never designed to eat that. But still, they're eating it continuously, just like most humans eat continuously. So you run into these same metabolic complications, and that's why we have this epidemic of these neurodegenerative diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and cancer.
Yeah, she was 17 and a half, and the first stroke.
That's pretty good for a dog.
Yeah, she was pretty old, and she had sarcopenia very developed. Like, she was really less than 4 pounds in the end.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Are there any drugs or smart drugs that you promote or that you have experimented with or are following in any way or are interested in?
No, I follow them. I'm not interested in any of them. I'm not a big fan of taking a drug. A lot of people in the longevity community use metformin, which I think can be emulated by berberine. I would not take metformin. Metformin has some downsides, as I think it impairs vitamin B12 metabolism, and it also can poison the mitochondria. So this is the law of unintended consequences, and that's exactly what happens when you take a drug. So yeah, there are some beneficial things in it. It stimulates AMP kinase, AMPK, but so does berberine, and it's a natural product, so it has to have a lot less of the side effects. So I take berberine on a pretty regular basis. For smart drugs, I was just at this conference last week, and I didn't realize it, but there's this nutrient called acetyl L-carnitine. Not L-carnitine, but acetyl L-carnitine. So that nutrient taken at about 2 to 2.5 grams a day has done unbelievable wonders. There's a lot of Italian research on it. So I was taking some, but I was probably only taking like 500 milligrams. So I bumped it up to like 2.5 grams a day. And I hope to see some of the improvement that is being done. But I think fish oil is another one, not the fish oil, but omega-3 fats, because I don't believe that fish oil is useful for most people because it's an ethyl ester and it's not as absorbed as well and has a lot of potential problems. If you take it in massive doses, and especially if you have some of sufficient phosphatidylcholine and phospholipids, you can pass it through there, but it's not the right constituent to be absorbed effectively by your body. So that's a incredible way to improve brain health. But I like the phospholipid forms of marine oils. So the problem with algae oil, which would probably is what you're taking, is that it's the ethyl ester form. So it's not absorbed as well. So you need really large doses of it. And I think that's only DHA. I don't think there's any algae EPA, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I could be incorrect on it, but I think it's primarily DHA.
What about resveratrol? It's a natural substance.
Yeah. Well, yeah, resveratrol is useful. There's a little bit of controversy about that. What is its primary benefit? It's perceived to stimulate SIRT1, and interestingly, though, SIRT1, I mean, you could stimulate to the max. It will not work if you're NAD deficient.
I think that researcher got caught like fabricating his.
Yeah, David Sinclair.
There was like a big scandal around.
Yeah, and then it's not really well absorbed. Resveratrol, there are higher versions or more well absorbed versions, like methylated versions, like pterostilbene, that is better absorbed. So it's not unreasonable. But what I do is I just take the like grape seeds, crunch them up, put them in a powder, and I swallow those. That's the original thing. So, again, seeds, right? There's the net, because who knows? There's probably other phytonutrients that are going to be useful that haven't even yet been discovered. So, but NAD gets back to the EMF, because I was talking about how that peroxynitrate gets generated, and when that happens, it actually causes the peroxynitrate breaks up the DNA, causes damage, and your body fortunately has systems to repair that. The primary one is called PARP, or poly-ADP ribose polymerase. But guess what? PARP is a radical consumer, and most people, it's a major way that we lose NAD. So if you have a lot of EMF exposure, your NAD levels are going in a tank or in the toilet, and then your SIRT2ins don't work well because there's not enough NAD to fuel them. You need the whole system working. So you got to look at the whole picture, not just one isolated component and think swallow resveratrol and you think it's going to be the answer. It's not. There's a lot. I've been studying longevity for a while now, and I'm currently fascinated with senolytics. Are you familiar with senescent cells and the removal of them?
Yeah. Well, depending whether like you qualify Dr. Aubrey DeBray in that vein, in that case, absolutely yes.
Well, so what's a senescent cell? Senescent cell is a cell that is old and damaged, not necessarily old, but it's damaged. Typically, the DNA is oxidized or broken apart, and as a result, it stops reproducing. And we've known that for a long time, but I just recently appreciated the fact that that is actually a helpful strategy for your body. Because why? See, why would that be useful? Because guess what? It's the way that your body prevents cancer from going crazy. It stops the cell from reproducing. Yay, right? So that it stops cancer. And obviously it's not effective in everyone, but it's one of the ways that your body has to stop cancer. It makes senescent cells. But they clog up your system, and they make these inflammatory cytokines that go in and just increases chronic inflammation in your body, which is just a disaster. So there are drugs. Actually, quercetin is not a drug. It's a flavonoid. It's one of the most common flavonoids that people eat. But they're combining with, I think, datasnib, or I forget, another drug that they're using in studying as a senolytic, which is a chemical that removes these senescent cells. But there's a really great researcher. Her name is Judith Campisi, I think, and she's out of California. And I was just reading one of her papers that was just published last month, and she was looking at this. I had never heard of it before. It is a polyphenol from Indian long peppers. It's called Piper longum. Let me just see what the name of that. It's called Piper longumen. Piper longumen, and she did this study that showed that it actually activates OXR1. I think that's the name of it. I could have the acronym wrong, but essentially it's a pathway that causes that normally this inhibits the production of beneficial antioxidants that your body makes, like SOD and catalase, but inhibits it. So it actually, she's showing that when you stop the inhibition, it increases in the oxidative stress, because normally, these these senescent cells are loaded with these cytokines. They're exposed to all the oxidative stress that they persist because they have the protective mechanism, this OXR1. So when you did this, they give the individuals these types of phytonutrients, they actually cause the senescent cells to explode and die, and get picked up by autophagy. So it's pretty incredible. So that's one. Fisetin is another polyphenol that's being looked at as a natural senolytic, and it's in strawberries primarily, but it's also in the peels of apple, maybe even higher concentrations. So I'm looking at getting some of those Indian long peppers, and I'm already taking apple peels. I've got a lot of organic apple peels I use in my diet. So I like to keep it natural. So those are the, because removing senescent cells from your body is a really important strategy. And it's just emerging as an important topic in some of the longevity circles. And then also optimizing your NAD levels, which I do with some precursors.
Absolutely, I agree completely. What about stuff like some people would maybe even call it a little bit in the woo-woo range, like meditation?
Oh no, it's not. It's not in the woo-woo at all. It's a very effective, powerful thing. Unfortunately, I'm going to probably start again. I used an app called Muse and Calm, MUSE. It's a little heaven. They just was one of the highlights I got from watching Exponential Medicine in 2018. This last 2 weeks is they actually launched or announced a new Muse band. So it has some other sensors that measures heart rate and breathing rate and some other interesting things. So I'm looking forward to getting that device. I'm probably going to start meditating again, but it's profoundly effective benefits. It's a form of neurofeedback training. It lowers your heart rate. There's a lot of good studies. And one of the scientists they had present at Exponential Medicine was sharing some data on how it actually improved longevity and functioning, which I was unaware of, and I'm probably sharing that information inaccurately, but it was an interesting presentation.
Yeah, there's a researcher somewhere, I forget whether he's in the University of Washington or something like that, who's been having access for decades to the Dalai Lama and some of his best monks, and he has some absolutely fascinating, amazing research. Mm-hmm. fMRI and all kinds of other research, and he's on my wish list actually of people to interview to talk about the actual science, the scientific proof that there's so much benefit to this. Okay, so we've been talking here for probably well over an hour by now, maybe an hour.
Coming up on 2.
15 minutes. We had some interruptions.
We had technical difficulties, right?
Yeah, technical difficulties too, but let's say an hour and a half. So let me see in the sort of closing period here of our conversation. Is there something that I should have asked you and that I didn't ask you? Something that's very important, be it for health, be it for longevity, or something else that you want to share with me?
Yeah, what didn't have a chance to go back into is this form of what is causing all this oxidative stress that's contributing to the free radical theory, because it's really, that's not the free radical theory from Harman converted to the mitochondrial theory of aging, which I think is more accurate, because most of the oxidative stress is generated within the mitochondria. And it was thought for the longest time, certainly when I went to med school and even up until the early 2000s, that the biggest contributor to free radical damage is hydroxyl free radical. You're familiar with that, right? First you go to superoxide, then you go to hydroxyl free radical, or hydrogen peroxide, then hydroxyl free radical. But the reason, and it's there's no question it's a pernicious free radical, but the paper that I mentioned earlier by Paul about peroxynitrite goes into this in great detail. But the superoxide, the hydroxyl free radical is very, very short-lived. It only lasts like a billionth of a second. That means the consequence of that is it can't travel very far. So when it's generated in the mitochondria, it essentially cannot travel outside the mitochondria. It can't. And so it's only going to damage the mitochondria, which is a problem. But, and actually one of the reasons why you want to eat cyclically ketogenic, because you're having too many carbs and you're not able to have that metabolic flexibility, that's sort of dirty fuel, and you're going to increase the oxidative stress and mitochondrial damage. So, here's the issue. That peroxynitrite that's formed with EMF, that lasts 9 billion times longer than hydroxyl free radical. Can easily transfer out of the mitochondria into the cytoplasm and into the nucleus and cause damage to the DNA. And it could go back and forth and go between cells. It's so flexible. So that's why that's an issue. That's why most of the stress, the oxidative stress, is likely related to these reactive nitrogen species, like, sorry about that. So that is a big issue. So that's why it's so important to really address the EMF components. And one of the best, I mean, we really could talk about it for 3 hours, and I talk a lot of it on my site at Mercola.com. But there's a book, if you want to just pick something up, it's the EMF, the non-tinfoil hat guide to EMF by Nicholas, who's a Canadian. I think he's out of Montreal. So that's a really good book, and it can kind of give you a shortcut on that. But you don't want to drive your car with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake, right? Not good for your engine or for your brakes. So you want to ideally take the foot off the gas, which is like minimize your EMF exposure so that your biology is working and functioning well, and then the other beneficial things you're doing can be really healthy.
I see. Very well. So what would be kind of the best place for other people to find more about you and your work?
The best place to reach me is Mercola.com, Mercola.com. We have a daily newsletter. And if you wanted to get that free chapter, you can write me at media@Mercola.com. And whenever I finish it, we'll send you a copy. But it's right now, it's 100 pages and 400 references. And I think it might be double that by the time I finish. I don't know. I mean, it's almost a book. But I'm happy to share it with those who are interested, because I think it will give you some really good value and giving your body the nutrition it needs to fight these chronic degenerative diseases.
Fantastic. Dr. Mercola, we had a very wide-ranging conversation with you today for over an hour and a half, perhaps. What would be the final message, the most important thing that you want to send us away with?
Okay. Well, it's the motto of our site is that you can take control of your health. If you're watching this, you probably know that already. But just to hopefully catalyze and inspire you that you have that, and not to rely on physicians or the conventional medical system, and challenge them. Thank God we have the resource of the internet that you can independently access this. You can use PubMed, and almost half the articles are free in PubMed. So you can get a pretty good idea what's going on and get a consensus, and not listen to anyone who's believing them they have the view of the truth. So research it yourself, which is what I do. So you don't believe anything I say, go to the literature, and talk to some of the experts. I try to summarize that for you to speed up the process, because not all of us have the luxury. That's the only thing I do for the most part, and that's my passion. So I'm able to provide you information and share what I learned. But do it yourself, especially if you have a specific problem, a real health challenge. So don't rely on it. And even though the entire conventional medical field and the public health authorities are telling you something, it may not be true. Really evaluate it very carefully, because your life may depend on it.
Dr. Mercola, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, you're most welcome.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.